He was a forgotten West Texas hero, a blind Marine abandoned by the very country he bled for, standing before a combat dog sentenced to die. They said Viper was too damaged, a broken weapon pacing the sweltering, dust-choked kennels of the El Paso K-9 rehab unit, with murder in his amber eyes. But when this scarred veteran stepped up to the rusted chain-link fence, what happened next wasn't some miraculous training technique. It was absolute, undeniable divine grace. This is a story of profound redemption, a blood-forged bond that death couldn't erase, and a whispered command that reached across 7 agonizing years of silence. Before we witness this miracle, drop your city or state in the comments, and type amen if you truly believe second chances are sent from heaven. The brutal midday sun in West Texas beat down like a fiery anvil, baking the cracked concrete and filling the air with the scent of hot diesel. Behind the rusted, razor-wire gates of the county's last resort K-9 compound, Viper paced relentlessly, his claws clicking a rhythm of pure, unadulterated survival and isolated rage. He was a massive, battle-scarred German shepherd with a mangled left ear and a terrifying gaze that had already sent 3 seasoned handlers straight to the hospital. Inside the stifling, sterile briefing room, Captain Mitchell slammed a heavily redacted file onto a metal desk, his voice echoing with the heavy burden of finality. "We are out of options with this animal," Mitchell growled, wiping sweat from his brow. "He's an untrainable, loaded weapon, and I'm putting in the euthanasia request." Standing quietly in the corner, Officer Sarah Jenkins clenched her fists, her piercing green eyes flashing with quiet defiance beneath her perfectly tight auburn hair bun. "Just give us one more day, Captain," Sarah pleaded, desperation leaking into her voice. "I've seen traumatized working dogs turn it around when they finally feel safe." Mitchell shook his head with grim resolve, dismissing her plea, just as the front gate buzzer loudly announced the arrival of an unexpected, solitary visitor. Caleb Reed stepped through the heavy gates, a tall, powerfully built man moving with deliberate slowness, his long white cane tapping rhythmically against the sun-baked gravel. He wore a faded olive-green Marine Corps shirt and combat boots that had tasted the sands of Fallujah, his sightless eyes shielded behind dark aviator sunglasses. Sarah met him in the sweltering courtyard, her clipboard trembling slightly as she took in the quiet, commanding presence of a man clearly haunted by unseen ghosts. "A buddy at Fort Bliss said you had a dog here nobody could reach," Caleb said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that instantly demanded absolute respect. Hesitant but intrigued by the blind veteran's unshakable calm, Sarah silently led him toward the isolated south yard where Viper waited in his sweltering, chain-link prison. "He's right in front of you," Sarah whispered nervously, entirely forgetting for a brief, breathless moment that Caleb couldn't see the deadly predator watching him intently. "Good," Caleb murmured, standing perfectly still. As Viper approached the fence, "He sees me, and I know exactly the kind of hell he's been living in." Caleb didn't flinch, as the massive German shepherd pressed his scarred snout against the chain link, smelling the familiar scent of gun oil and old sand. "I've been in those dark places too," the blind Marine whispered softly, his deep voice carrying over the whistling West Texas desert wind. Sarah stood frozen, her heart pounding against her ribs as she expected the vicious lunges that had hospitalized 3 of her toughest colleagues. Instead of baring his teeth, Viper let out a low, trembling exhale, his amber eyes locked onto the unseeing aviator glasses of the veteran. "You hear the bombs when you close your eyes, don't you?" Caleb murmured, slowly lowering his foldable white cane to the sun-baked concrete floor. Up in the suffocating heat of the control booth, the unit captain watched through the dusty glass, his thick arms crossed tightly over his chest. He had ordered the euthanasia paperwork printed that morning, fully convinced the broken combat dog was nothing more than a lethal, unpredictable liability. Viper took a single, deliberate step forward, his thick black and sable fur bristling as he analyzed the strange, fearless man before him. "You are not broken, and neither am I," Caleb said, his voice a steady anchor in the chaotic, violent sea of the dog's trauma. Sarah exhaled a breath she didn't realize she was holding, quickly reaching for the black radio clipped to her dark navy blue police uniform. "Captain, are you seeing this?" she whispered into the mic, her green eyes wide with an impossible, fragile hope blooming in the stifling heat. The radio crackled with heavy static before the gruff voice replied, ordering her to clear Caleb for the indoor concrete training enclosure immediately. "If that unpredictable animal bites him, his blood is entirely on your hands, Jenkins," the captain warned, the threat hanging heavy in the oppressive air. Caleb slowly raised his scarred, calloused hand, letting it hover just inches away from the rusted metal wire separating him from the lethal canine. Viper didn't snap or growl. The traumatized animal simply leaned his heavy head closer to the warmth radiating from the veteran's outstretched palm. The transition to the indoor training enclosure felt like stepping into a refrigerated concrete tomb, the air heavy with bleach, dampness, and raw tension. Cold fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like an angry swarm of hornets, illuminating the barren room where Viper's true, unleashed test would finally begin. Caleb stood perfectly centered in the chilling room, entirely unarmed and without any protective bite sleeves, relying solely on his heightened remaining senses. Behind the reinforced glass partition, a squad of tense officers gathered, their hands resting nervously near their holstered weapons as the gate clicked. Sarah's trembling finger hovered over the heavy metal release button, her mind racing as she prepared to let the apex predator into the sealed room. The heavy steel gate ground open with a metallic screech, echoing terribly against the bare, cold concrete walls of the sterile training enclosure. For one agonizing heartbeat, nothing moved in the stark room, the heavy silence thick enough to choke the squad of officers watching behind the glass. Then Viper stepped into the harsh fluorescent light, his thick shoulders hunched low and his torn claws clicking sharply against the polished, damp floor. The massive German shepherd scanned the claustrophobic space, the deep scar across his snout flexing with every jagged, terrified breath he took. He looked like a dark, coiled spring of muscle and fury, fully prepared to tear apart anything that dared to move within his striking distance. But the moment his piercing amber eyes locked onto the solitary, unmoving figure of Caleb Reed, the battle-hardened dog froze completely in his tracks. Caleb didn't flinch, didn't raise his hands in defense, and didn't wear the thick, padded bite sleeve standard for these lethal encounters. "I know that heavy pause, buddy," Caleb murmured, his deep, gravelly voice effortlessly cutting through the freezing, bleach-scented air of the enclosure. "You aren't planning an attack right now. You're just listening, waiting for the hidden sniper, waiting for the next explosive to drop." Behind the reinforced safety glass, Sarah pressed her hands flat against the cold pane, her green eyes wide, as she desperately bypassed the camera's auto-record. "He's going to lunge in 5 seconds, a burly officer whispered behind her, his hand nervously unbuttoning the leather strap of his duty holster. Viper took one slow, deliberate step forward, his ears swiveling toward the blind veteran, trying to decipher the impossible calm radiating from the man. "I know the kind of fear that doesn't bark," Caleb continued softly, lowering his calloused, empty palm toward the cold concrete floor. "The kind of terror born in the burning sands of Fallujah, the kind that buries itself deep in your bones and completely owns your sleep." The scarred German shepherd stopped merely inches from Caleb's outstretched hand, his thick chest expanding rapidly as he took in the veteran's scent. Caleb didn't move a single muscle, allowing the deadly apex predator to sniff the faded olive-green fabric of his old Marine Corps t-shirt. Slowly, miraculously, Viper lowered his heavy, scarred head until his cold nose gently hovered just beneath Caleb's rough, trembling fingertips. With a long, shuddering exhale that seemed to release years of pent-up agony, the massive combat dog sat down obediently on the damp floor. The entire observation room went deathly silent. Hardened police officers stared in utter disbelief as the untrainable killer morphed into a loyal, waiting soldier. Sarah choked back a sudden, overwhelming sob, realizing she wasn't just recording a behavioral breakthrough, she was witnessing an absolute, undeniable miracle of grace. The heavy silence in the observation room was shattered by the captain bursting through the heavy steel door, his face flushed with absolute disbelief. "How long has he been in there?" the captain demanded, staring down at the blind Marine, who was now calmly stroking the lethal predator. Sarah didn't look away from the thick safety glass, her voice trembling slightly as she replied, 3 minutes longer than anyone else ever survived." The captain frowned deeply, his hardened eyes narrowing as he watched the massive, unapproachable dog rest its scarred head intimately against Caleb's knee. Down in the freezing concrete enclosure, Caleb slowly knelt beside the massive German shepherd, ignoring the painful popping in his old, combat-worn joints. "You want out of this freezing cage, don't you?" Caleb whispered, his calloused fingers gently tracing the deep, jagged scar across Viper's snout. Viper let out a soft, high-pitched whine, nuzzling much closer to the blind veteran, as if terrified the man might suddenly vanish into dust. "I don't have my eyes anymore," Caleb murmured, a profound sorrow anchoring his gravelly voice. "But you and I, we still see the ghosts." Later that sweltering afternoon, Caleb sat quietly on a wooden bench outside the dusty rehab unit, sipping bitter coffee from a flimsy paper cup. He wasn't alone. Viper was curled peacefully at his combat boots, a sleeping, scarred giant who refused to leave the unseeing veteran's side. Sarah walked out into the blinding West Texas sun, a thick, heavily redacted military file clutched tightly against her dark navy blue uniform. "I've never seen anything like that in my entire career," she said softly, taking a seat beside the silent Marine and his loyal guardian. Caleb took a slow sip of his black coffee, his unreadable, sun-weathered face tilted slightly toward the howling, hot desert wind. "He hasn't moved from your side all day," Sarah noted, her green eyes studying the massive dog with a mix of awe and lingering caution. "He won't," Caleb stated with absolute, unshakable certainty, his hand resting heavily on the dog's shoulder. "Not unless he is officially ordered to." That night, a restless, suffocating heat settled over the quiet compound, and Caleb tossed violently on his narrow, squeaking cot in the dark quarters. Traumatic nightmares of a buried Syrian mission flooded his mind, deafening gunfire, screaming, and a harsh voice shouting foreign tactical commands in the absolute darkness. He woke up in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs, only to feel a heavy, comforting weight rest upon his chest. Viper was standing over him in the dark room, his glowing amber eyes watching the blind veteran with a profound, intelligent, and silent empathy. Reaching blindly into his open duffel bag for painkillers, Caleb's hand brushed against a strange object, an old, brass-tagged tactical collar he didn't pack. Caleb ran his calloused thumb over the worn brass tag, tracing a faded serial number and the initials S.M. etched deep into the hardened leather. He had absolutely no memory of packing it, yet holding it in the suffocating heat of the West Texas night sent a sharp thrill of recognition down his spine. Viper let out a single, low bark, staring intently at the tarnished collar as if respectfully greeting an old, deeply missed commanding officer. The next morning, as the blistering sun burned away the lingering chill, Officer Sarah Jenkins sat hunched over a glowing terminal in the station's dusty back office. Her auburn hair was coming loose from its tight bun, her green eyes narrowed as she tirelessly dug through heavily classified military canine registries. Something about Viper's missing history deeply bothered her. It wasn't the typical aggressive dog profile. It felt like a deliberate, layered government cover-up. She aggressively narrowed her search to Middle Eastern shadow deployments from 7 years ago, hunting for canine assets that officially didn't exist on paper. A heavily redacted file labeled Operation Winter Halo flashed on her screen, detailing a canine asset designated V-Alpha, abandoned during a Syrian extraction. "You're chasing deadly ghosts, Jenkins," her supervisor warned, sipping bitter coffee from a stained mug as he leaned heavily over her cluttered metal desk. "Maybe," Sarah replied, pulling off her glasses. "But one of those ghosts is sleeping in our yard, and someone went to extraordinary lengths to erase him." Meanwhile, out in the sun-baked training yard, Caleb stood before Captain Mitchell, the mysterious tactical collar hanging loosely from his scarred right hand. Mitchell crossed his thick arms, the glare of the desert sun reflecting off his dark aviators, as he evaluated the blind Marine's unbelievable claim. "You're seriously telling me this lethal animal served with you overseas?" the captain asked, a deep crease of heavy skepticism forming on his forehead. "I'm telling you, he reacts to my voice like I used to give him orders. Even in a foreign tactical language I don't consciously remember speaking," Caleb replied evenly. Viper sat quietly in the sparse shade of a mesquite tree, untethered and unbothered, his amber eyes locked faithfully on the calm, unseeing veteran. Caleb held up the worn leather collar. "This wasn't in his official transfer file, Captain, but somehow it was perfectly hidden in my personal duffel bag." Mitchell took the hardened leather, turning the tarnished brass tag in his thick fingers as the heavy, unspoken implications slowly settled over them. "Are you suggesting someone planted a classified asset in your gear and wiped your memory?" Mitchell asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, hushed whisper. "I'm suggesting someone desperately wants me to remember exactly what we left behind in the sand," Caleb said, his jaw tightening with renewed, fierce purpose. That evening, alone in her dimly lit office, Sarah stared at the encrypted message boards, realizing the initials S.M. belonged to Silas Mercer, a ruthless former colonel. Early morning dust rolls into the West Texas K-9 compound, setting a tense, quiet atmosphere before the inevitable, violent storm finally breaks. A sleek, blacked-out government SUV pulls aggressively up to the rusted gates, completely ignoring the standard county police check-in protocols. Silas Mercer steps out, his spotless military uniform cutting a sharp, unnatural contrast against the dusty, sun-baked, and unforgiving desert environment. Caleb waits silently inside a cramped, portable command trailer behind the main yard, instinctively feeling the sudden, cold shift in the heavy air. Silas enters without knocking, his highly polished black combat boots clicking ominously and aggressively against the cheap, flimsy linoleum floor of the trailer. "You officially died in the Syrian desert, Reed," Silas states coldly, his emotionless silver-gray eyes completely devoid of any lingering human empathy. Caleb remains perfectly still in his chair, his sightless eyes hidden behind his aviators as he listens to the ruthless commander who erased him. "You disobeyed a direct extraction order during Operation Winter Halo to save a civilian child, compromising our entire shadow mission," Silas growls softly. "I pulled a terrified 6-year-old girl from the rubble," Caleb replies evenly.
"Do this my way,
"And you ruthlessly left me and my K9 partner behind to burn." Silas takes a menacing step closer, the temperature in the small room seemingly dropping as he issues a terrifying, thinly veiled government threat. "That dangerous animal remembers entirely too much, and if you don't disappear quietly, the agency will permanently silence you both," Silas sneers viciously. Caleb refuses to flinch, rising slowly and deliberately to his feet, to face the former colonel with an unbreakable, righteous, and silent defiance. Across the sweltering compound, Sarah is locked safely inside the dusty archive room, frantically plugging a stolen, encrypted flash drive into an old laptop. She holds her breath in agonizing suspense as a grainy, corrupted audio file finally decrypts, revealing a chaotic combat recording from 7 years ago. Through the heavy static and deafening background gunfire, a younger, desperate voice shouts sharp tactical German commands to a K9 officially designated as V-Alpha. Sarah gasps sharply, covering her trembling mouth, as she instantly recognizes Caleb's deep, gravelly voice, actively commanding the very dog sleeping in their yard. The terrifying truth violently crashes over her. Silas didn't just abandon a loyal soldier, he systematically wiped a hero's mind to bury a crime. She yanks the encrypted drive out, her piercing green eyes blazing with fierce determination as she sprints out of the stuffy room toward Caleb. Out in the sun-baked yard, Viper senses the rising, dangerous tension, pacing aggressively along the rusted fence as Silas marches back to his vehicle. Caleb steps calmly out of the stifling trailer, his calloused hand resting securely on Viper's massive head, fully prepared for the brutal coming war. A dismal, cold rain began to fall heavily over El Paso, transforming the usually sun-baked streets into a slick, grey mirror of overcast skies. Seeking to prove the dog's miraculous rehabilitation, Caleb guided Viper carefully along the wet concrete sidewalk, his white cane sweeping rhythmically ahead. Viper walked perfectly in step with the blind Marine, his thick, sable fur growing dark and heavy as the cold rain continuously pelted his broad back. Several paces behind them, Sarah Jenkins followed closely, her dark navy blue uniform dampening as she carefully observed the pair navigating the chaotic civilian environment. Without warning, a massive metal dumpster lid in a nearby alleyway slammed shut, echoing down the wet street with the deafening, sharp crack of a gunshot. The violent sound instantly shattered Viper's fragile peace, his severe PTSD triggering violently as the rainy Texas street morphed into a deadly Syrian war zone. With a terrifying, guttural roar, the massive German shepherd lunged forward aggressively, his sharp canines bared as he sought to destroy the perceived unseen threat. The sudden, explosive force jerked Caleb violently forward, causing his foldable white cane to slip from his grip and clatter uselessly onto the rain-slicked asphalt. Absolute chaos erupted on the street as panicked pedestrians screamed in sheer terror, dropping their black umbrellas and scrambling frantically to escape the snarling beast. Sarah sprinted forward through the driving rain, desperately reaching for her heavy-duty belt, terrified that a frightened civilian or responding officer might shoot the dog. "Viper, no!" Caleb shouted over the roaring traffic, but his desperate English pleas were completely lost in the deafening, traumatic echoes of heavy artillery in the dog's mind. Realizing the present reality was completely gone for his partner, Caleb ruthlessly threw himself down onto his knees on the freezing, wet concrete sidewalk. Ignoring the very real danger of being severely bitten, the blind veteran blindly thrust his bare, calloused hands forward through the torrential, freezing rain. His trembling fingers found the slick, wet leather of Viper's tactical collar, and instantly, a deeply buried, locked memory ripped violently to the surface of his mind. "Halt! Sits!" Caleb roared over the storm, his deep voice instinctively projecting the harsh, perfectly accented German tactical commands he had been forced to forget. Viper froze perfectly mid-lunge, his massive muscles locking instantly as the deeply ingrained, authoritative voice sliced cleanly through his terrifying, chaotic combat flashback. The lethal combat dog immediately dropped his heavy hips onto the slick asphalt, sitting rigidly at absolute attention in the middle of the screaming, panicked crowd. Caleb lunged forward, wrapping his strong, muscular arms protectively around the soaked, trembling animal, physically grounding the terrified dog back in the present moment. Across the rain-slicked street, a stunned young bystander slowly lowered her glowing smartphone, having just captured the entire miraculous, heart-stopping interaction in high definition. Sarah skidded to a halt on the wet pavement, staring in absolute, breathtaking shock at the undeniable proof of their unbreakable, blood-forged battlefield bond. Within hours of the terrifying El Paso Street incident, the bystander's shaky smartphone video exploded across every major social media platform nationwide. Millions of Americans watched in stunned, tearful silence as the blind combat veteran miraculously calmed the lethal, traumatized beast with a single whispered command. But back at the sweltering West Texas K-9 compound, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense as Captain Mitchell slammed his heavy office phone down violently. "The Pentagon just called Jenkins," Mitchell barked, rubbing his sweating face aggressively. "Silas Mercer and his shadow agents are coming to seize the dog tonight." Sarah crossed her arms defiantly, her green eyes blazing with righteous fury beneath the harsh, flickering overhead fluorescent lights of the sterile briefing room. "They aren't taking Viper just to casually retire him, Captain," Sarah pleaded passionately. "They are going to permanently bury the evidence of their Syrian war crimes." Out in the quiet, dusty yard, Caleb sat heavily on the wooden bench, his calloused fingers buried deep in Viper's thick, comforting sable fur. The violent adrenaline of the street trigger had fully shattered the psychological wall in his mind, flooding his consciousness with suppressed, agonizing combat memories. He clearly remembered the blinding sandstorms, the deafening explosions, and the agonizing moment he was ruthlessly ordered to leave his bleeding K-9 partner behind. "I remember absolutely everything now, buddy," Caleb whispered into the gathering desert dusk, feeling the massive German shepherd press heavily against his muscular leg. As the blazing Texas sun finally dipped below the rugged horizon, a terrifying convoy of blacked-out government SUVs rapidly approached the quiet, isolated facility. Silas Mercer stepped out into the freezing desert night, dressed entirely in sleek, black tactical agency gear, accompanied by heavily armed, faceless shadow operatives. "Secure the perimeter and retrieve the classified animal immediately," Silas commanded coldly, his silver-gray eyes scanning the dimly lit compound with ruthless, mechanical precision. Inside the dark handler's quarters, Sarah frantically shoved a pair of heavy bolt cutters and encrypted hard drives into a dark tactical survival backpack. "We only have one desperate option left," she whispered urgently to Caleb, quickly adjusting her auburn bun as she handed him his foldable white cane. "They want a ghost to disappear quietly in the dark," Caleb replied, his deep voice rumbling with fierce determination. "So, let's give them a ghost." Slipping silently through the freezing, moonlit shadows of the K-9 yard, the trio reached the heavily rusted chain-link fence at the compound's rear perimeter. With a sharp, metallic snap that echoed loudly in the terrifying silence, Sarah's heavy bolt cutters sliced cleanly through the thick steel wire boundary. Viper slipped through the fresh opening with practiced, silent military precision, instantly falling into a perfect protective formation beside the blind Marine. They vanished seamlessly into the freezing, desolate expanse of the West Texas desert, leaving the furious, heavily armed government agents staring at an empty cage. The vast, freezing expanse of the West Texas desert stretched out endlessly beneath a pale, unforgiving moon, hiding the fleeing trio in its deep, rocky shadows. Caleb moved with an astonishing, fluid grace for a blind man, trusting his heightened senses and Viper's steady, unyielding presence entirely. The massive German shepherd took the lead, his thick black and sable fur blending perfectly into the freezing night as he navigated the treacherous, rocky terrain. "They'll triangulate our exact position within 20 minutes using thermal drones," Sarah whispered breathlessly, her dark navy blue uniform covered in pale desert dust. "We don't need 20 minutes," Caleb replied smoothly, his deep voice carrying over the whistling desert wind. "We just need to reach the old Cold War ruins." Back at the compound, Silas Mercer stood furiously before the shredded chain-link fence, his emotionless silver-grey eyes narrowing into a dangerous, lethal glare. "They are completely on foot." Silas snarled to his heavily armed operatives, "Deploy the thermal trackers immediately. I want that animal executed on sight." A fleet of sleek, blacked-out SUVs roared violently to life, their massive tires aggressively tearing up the desert gravel as they initiated the ruthless manhunt. Deep in the rocky basin of the desert, the crumbling, ghostly concrete ruins of an abandoned comms post finally emerged from the freezing darkness. It was the perfect tactical high ground, a terrifyingly isolated location Caleb had deliberately chosen not for an escape, but for a devastating final stand. Sarah frantically set up a single, blinding white LED flood lamp near the crumbling concrete ridge, aiming it aggressively downward toward the only approaching dirt road. Pulling a heavy, encrypted satellite phone from her dusty tactical backpack, she rapidly typed out a final, desperate message to every major national news outlet. "I just sent the completely unredacted Winter Halo files to the press," Sarah gasped, her green eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fierce defiance. "Get completely clear of the blast zone, Sarah," Caleb ordered firmly, planting his white cane solidly onto the dry, cracked earth of the high ridge. "I'm absolutely not leaving you to face those ruthless assassins alone," she argued passionately, her freckled face tightening with profound, unyielding loyalty. "They want to hunt a blind ghost in the dark," Caleb said, a fierce, terrifying calm settling over his scarred face. "So let them walk into my nightmare." Viper let out a sudden, incredibly low, and terrifyingly guttural growl, his piercing amber eyes locking onto the distant, pitch-black horizon line. The faint, ominous crunch of heavy tires rolling aggressively over loose desert gravel echoed up from the dark, freezing valley floor below them. Three massive, blacked-out SUVs cut their headlights completely, sliding silently and lethally through the dark scrub brush, like giant, predatory metal sharks. The breathless, agonizing wait was finally over. Silas Mercer and his faceless shadow operatives had arrived to permanently silence the heroes of Winter Halo. The heavy black SUVs ground to a violent halt at the base of the rocky ridge, their heavy doors swinging open in perfect, terrifying unison. Four heavily armed, faceless operatives spread out systematically, raising their suppressed rifles smoothly toward the crumbling concrete ruins above them. Silas Mercer stepped forward calmly, the pale moonlight catching his spotless black tactical gear and his cold, emotionless silver-gray eyes. "It's entirely over, Reed," Silas shouted up the rocky incline, his voice echoing with absolute, terrifying authority through the freezing desert canyon. "You cannot outrun the system, and you certainly cannot protect that broken animal from a classified federal extraction order." Caleb stood motionless at the edge of the precipice, his foldable white cane planted firmly in the dirt, completely unbothered by the drawn weapons. "I didn't bring you out to this freezing desert to run, Silas," Caleb replied, his deep voice rumbling outward like an approaching thunderstorm. "I brought you out here to finally expose exactly what kind of monster you are to the entire watching world." Silas sneered viciously, raising his hand and gesturing sharply for his tactical operatives to advance aggressively up the steep, treacherous gravel incline. Viper stepped boldly in front of the blind Marine, his thick muscles coiling tightly as he let out a terrifying, bone-rattling roar of pure protection. "Fass!" Caleb shouted with explosive, sudden force, unleashing the highly trained K9 with a lethal, deeply ingrained German combat command. Viper launched himself down the steep rocky ridge, like a dark, guided missile, moving with terrifying speed and absolute military precision. The massive German Shepherd hit the lead operative with the devastating force of a freight train, knocking the heavy suppressed rifle violently into the dirt. Silas cursed aggressively, swiftly drawing his own sleek tactical sidearm as absolute chaos erupted in the pitch-black, freezing valley below. Suddenly, the deafening roar of approaching heavy helicopters shattered the desert silence, their massive rotor blades chopping violently through the freezing night air. "Now, Sarah!" Caleb roared over the deafening chaos, standing tall and unmoving on the edge of the crumbling concrete ruins as the wind whipped his shirt. Sarah violently slammed her hand down onto the heavy switch of the massive LED flood lamp she had secretly positioned perfectly on the ridge edge. A blinding, stark white beam of light exploded across the valley, instantly blinding the heavily armed operatives stumbling in the freezing darkness. The sudden, blinding illumination perfectly exposed Silas Mercer, catching him aiming his lethal sidearm directly at the blind, unarmed Marine veteran. Heavy, sweeping tactical spotlights from circling news helicopters suddenly joined the fray from above, trapping the ruthless shadow agents in an inescapable sea of light. The blinding helicopter spotlights completely paralyzed the ruthless shadow operatives as heavily armed state police vehicles rapidly swarmed the isolated, freezing desert valley. Silas Mercer slowly lowered his sleek tactical sidearm, his cold, silver-gray eyes finally realizing that his dark, buried secrets were entirely exposed to the world. State troopers swiftly disarmed the faceless shadow agents, completely securing the desert perimeter as national news cameras broadcasted the incredible standoff live across the country. Caleb stood tall on the crumbling concrete ridge, lowering his white cane slightly as Viper trotted faithfully back to his side, completely unharmed and victorious. Sarah rushed forward through the blinding lights, tears of profound relief streaming down her freckled face as she wrapped her arms tightly around the pair. "You actually did it, Caleb," Sarah whispered emotionally into the freezing desert wind. "The entire world finally knows the undeniable, absolute truth about Winter Halo." Weeks later, the dark, suffocating nightmare had finally given way to a breathtaking West Texas morning, casting a warm, golden glow across a new sanctuary. The profound, explosive impact of that miraculous night had completely rewritten military history, permanently restoring the tarnished honor of the forgotten, blind American hero. Silas Mercer faced severe federal treason charges, his ruthless shadow agency permanently dismantled by the overwhelming, furious public outcry demanded by millions of sympathetic viewers. Caleb Reed stood proudly in the tranquil courtyard of their new facility, his faded olive-green Marine t-shirt, a humble testament to his authentic, raw survival. The government officially recognized his incredible valor, but Caleb cared only for the absolute peace he finally felt standing beside his loyal, heavily scarred partner. Sitting perfectly at attention by his side was Viper, proudly wearing a clean, custom tactical vest with bright gold stitching that read, "Retired Combat Veteran." The massive German Shepherd didn't bark, growl, or pace aggressively anymore. He simply watched Caleb with a profound, unbroken loyalty that survived the deepest fires. Basking in the soft, golden hour amber light, Caleb reached down, gently resting his calloused, weather-beaten hand on Viper's broad, golden-stitched shoulder with absolute devotion. Far away from the suffocating dust of the county pound, a beautifully hand-carved wooden sign hung proudly above a welcoming, peaceful gate of green acacia trees. The intricately carved desert oak wood perfectly displayed the name the Hollow Path K9 Recovery Center, marking a permanent, beautiful haven for broken combat animals. Sarah Jenkins, now wearing a casual gray K9 unit polo shirt, smiled warmly as she adjusted the neat, dust-free gravel of the profoundly tranquil courtyard. The atmosphere was remarkably peaceful, grounded, and restorative, entirely devoid of the harsh, rusted chain-link fences that once imprisoned traumatized heroes in terrifying, isolated darkness. Caleb walked slowly and confidently through the welcoming wooden gates, his foldable white cane sweeping smoothly over the clean stones as Viper guided him perfectly. "Our very first rescue is arriving in 10 minutes, Sarah called out softly, her green eyes shining brightly with the promise of a beautiful redemption. A rusty, battered animal control truck pulls up slowly to the beautifully hand-carved sanctuary gates, carrying a terrified, deeply traumatized Belgian Malinois from a local shelter. The broken, malnourished dog cowers violently in the back of the metal transport cage, completely consumed by the same suffocating darkness that once imprisoned Viper. Caleb steps forward calmly into the golden sunlight, planting his white cane firmly on the smooth stones as Viper trots faithfully by his side to greet the newcomer. "Easy there, soldier. You are finally safe," Caleb murmurs softly, his deep, gravelly voice carrying a profound, healing warmth that instantly cuts through the animal's panic. Instead of aggressively barking, Viper simply sits quietly near the trembling metal cage, radiating a massive, grounded presence of absolute safety and unbreakable calm. The terrified Malinois slowly stops shaking, its wide, panicked eyes locking onto Viper's deeply scarred face with a fragile, hesitant spark of brand new hope. Sarah watches from the wooden porch, wiping a single, joyful tear from her freckled cheek as she witnesses the beautiful, miraculous cycle of healing begin all over again. "He isn't just surviving his trauma anymore, Caleb," Sarah whispers softly into the warm breeze. "He is actually teaching them exactly how to find their way back home." Later that evening, the deep amber sunset paints the vast West Texas sky in breathtaking, vivid strokes of purple and gold, signaling the end of a perfect day. Caleb sits peacefully on the hand-carved wooden porch of the recovery center, his sightless eyes turned upward toward the beautifully cooling, vast desert sky. Viper rests his heavy, scarred head gently upon Caleb's lap, his piercing amber eyes half closed in a state of absolute, undeniable earthly paradise. "Do you ever wonder if this peaceful place is truly enough to save them?" Sarah asks quietly, taking a seat beside the blind Marine on the smooth wooden step. Caleb reaches down, his calloused, weather-beaten fingers slowly tracing the bright gold stitching of Viper's tactical vest with immense, overwhelming gratitude. "For the ones we can reach, it is absolutely everything," Caleb answers, his voice thick with a raw, powerful emotional depth that completely transcends words. "And for the ones still lost out there in the freezing darkness?" Sarah asks, looking out over the tranquil, beautifully shadowed green acacia trees. "We just keep listening for their silent cries," Caleb replies firmly, "because no warrior, human or animal, should ever have to fight their terrifying demons alone." The profound, undeniable truth of his words hangs beautifully in the quiet desert air, a stunning testament to the miraculous power of unconditional love and divine grace. Their incredible journey from the blood-soaked sands of Syria to the peaceful stones of West Texas wasn't just a remarkable survival story, it was a holy resurrection. It is the living, breathing proof that the deepest, most agonizing wounds of war can finally be healed by the quiet, steadfast loyalty of a rescued dog. Sometimes, the precious things we completely lose in the terrible dark are not truly gone forever. They are simply waiting patiently for us to finally remember them. Caleb and Viper were violently torn apart by the brutal chaos of war, silenced by a corrupt system that chose fear over truth. But it wasn't extensive behavioral training or classified government paperwork that miraculously brought them back together in that dusty West Texas yard. It was something infinitely deeper. An unbreakable, blood-forged bond, born of absolute loyalty, profound sacrifice, and the kind of love that never fades. That, my friends, is exactly what we might humbly call a true, undeniable miracle in a world so often consumed by darkness. A genuine miracle isn't always a blinding flash of lightning from the heavens or a dramatic parting of a raging, stormy sea. Sometimes, a miracle is just a soft, desperate whisper cutting clearly through the terrifying, deafening storm of a completely broken mind. It is a scarred combat dog who waited patiently for years, and a blind, forgotten man who finally remembered how to see. It is that breathtaking, holy moment when the profound warmth of healing suddenly feels vastly bigger than the heavy, suffocating weight of pain. Some cynics and skeptics would easily dismiss this incredible reunion as mere coincidence, a random alignment of chaotic universe events. But those of us who have truly felt that quiet, divine guidance in our darkest, hardest days know it is something infinitely more. It is absolute grace, the undeniable, beautiful proof that God doesn't always have to shout to get our attention in the chaos. Sometimes, He simply sends a wounded warrior and a forgotten, scarred dog to beautifully remind us of our own inherent, eternal worth. To remind us that we are absolutely never abandoned, no matter how deeply we have been buried by the profound cruelty of the world. You are never broken beyond divine repair, you are deeply, unconditionally loved, and you can always find your way back to peace. If this profound story of Caleb and Viper touched your heart today, please share it with someone who desperately needs to hear it. Before you scroll away, please tell us exactly where you are watching from by dropping your city or state in the comments below. Type the word Amen in the comments if you truly believe in the beautiful, healing power of divine second chances and grace. Subscribe to our channel to join a community that celebrates these quiet miracles, true redemption, and the unbreakable bond of the human spirit. May God bless you exactly where you are today. May He guide your steps, calm your violent storms, and heal your deepest scars. And please remember, even in your darkest, most terrifying silence, you are always seen, always loved, and never truly walking alone. Amen. The story of Caleb and Viper is far more than a miraculous reunion. It is a profound testament to the invisible wounds of war and the healing power of shared trauma. Society often rushes to discard those it deems broken, labeling a traumatized veteran as a forgotten ghost and a terrified combat dog as a lethal liability. But true healing doesn't happen in the sterile isolation of a rusted cage. Caleb and Viper teach us that no soul is ever truly beyond repair. Their blood-forged bond proves that when the world abandons you to the freezing dark, salvation can be found in the unwavering loyalty of a fellow survivor. They remind us that the deepest, most agonizing scars aren't always visible, and the loudest cries for help are often completely silent. Our warriors, both two-legged and four-legged, sacrificed their peace of mind for our freedom. We owe them more than redacted files and quiet dismissals. We owe them absolute grace, profound patience, and a safe sanctuary to lay their heavy burdens down. Let this be a resounding reminder: never give up on the shattered. Within every scarred heart lies an unbreakable spirit, waiting only for someone to whisper, "You are finally safe."